Okay, so I'm just going to let the room keep filling up. I really have to, I want to start off just firstly by thanking a few people. I think first and foremost, I want to thank Eldon, who brought this idea to us, and Shimona, who helped quarterback. Oh, Rabbi Eli is here. Rabbi Eli stepped out of his simcha to join us. Rabbi Eli, good to see you. So Eldon, who brought this idea forward, and Shimona, who really helped pull this together. So I want to thank both of you so much. This is a very timely topic nowadays. You know, I think that that there's a lot greater awareness of our environment, of people's impact on the environment. It's an important thing to keep in mind. It's you know, we see there's a concept of what's called zootic illnesses, and zootic illnesses. I don't want to preempt anything. I don't know what the presenters are going to speak to, but a zootic illness is where we have an illness that kind of breaks the animal-person barrier. So, you know, we're all familiar with malaria, right? It comes from mosquitoes, it bites a person and you get sick. West Nile virus, more recently, we're all familiar with that. Certainly even things like the Black Plague going back in time, right? It was ticks and fleas that were carried and borne on the backs of the rats across Europe. So when we look more recently, you know, there's the idea that in China, you had a pangolin that ate a bat that was eaten by a person, the world gets sick, chad gadya, chad gadya. So, you know, there's this whole chain. The person who says that one person alone can't change the world never met the guy who ate a bat. So we have to be aware of our effect and our interactions here. So with that, I want to turn over to Eldon and ask him to introduce our speakers and the topic. So just Eldon, just press your space bar to unmute yourself. Okay?
There I go.
There you go.
I just wanted to give a bit of an idea where this came from. So a year ago, I approached Rabbi Eli with a lecture idea on wine, whiskey, and halacha. And so I wrote up the lecture, 2 series. It was fun. I like wine. I like good scotch. I don't drink very much of it, but it was fun. We were all locked down at that point, and it was a good point to do that. More recently, this January, I called up Rabbi Eli again, and I said, you know, I become mostly a vegetarian. I haven't eaten red meat in 15 years, and my wife, Jane, in the background, and I, over the past year, really, you know, have given up. We occasionally eat fish, but I'm mostly vegetarian, and it wasn't so difficult. And I approached Rabbi Eli. I said, let's do another lecture series. And he said, yeah, let's write it up together. And then I did research, and every bit of research I did came back to Dr. Schwartz. And so I thought, you know what? Why am I I'm just going to be saying everything he said. So I contacted the Jewish Dr. Schwartz, who actually went to he is a good friend of Rabbi Carfunkel's father. And Rabbi Carfunkel shared with me that the two of them played basketball, I believe, together, and that your son used to play ping pong in the Carfunkel's garage. So you went to the same shul in Staten Island, and so you're family friends too. So Rabbi Eli is really looking forward, especially to next week when you have a bit of a debate. So if you think this is going to be good, wait till next week, and these guys, start going back and forth. I'm really looking forward to that. So that's how it evolved, and I hope you all enjoy it, and you all have an open mind and eat well and live well. And I'll pass it to, and I want to thank Lisa and Sarah too.
I would be remiss if I didn't specifically thank Eldon, you and Jane as well for sponsoring the session. It was very generous of you to be able to make this happen. So
I
if
want
you
to thank Lisa and Sarah too. I've spoken to Lisa a whole bunch of times, and I don't think Sarah, and Shimona, of course, who was really instrumental. And Shimona is a vegetarian for many, many years. And so, with that, I'm going to pass it on to the speakers tonight, and we're all going to
so Eldon, can we just introduce the speakers?
Dr. Schwartz, Dr. Richard Schwartz, Lisa, and I don't know and Sarah. Yeah, Lisa. I'm not going to pronounce her last name. So I don't want to make. You want to pronounce your last name, Lisa? I'm sorry.
Lisa Apfelberg. Hi, everyone. I live in Austin, Texas, and I have been working in the Jewish vegan world for about 5 years. And I'm very excited for all the planning I did with you, Eldon and Shimona. It was really fun, and we're so excited to be presenting. This is now like our 4th Canadian synagogue. And I am going to turn it over to Sarah, who can introduce herself. And then she has a great presentation for us. And then she's going to bring Richard in, who you'll get to hear more from as well. But thank you so much for supporting us and inviting us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Eldon and Rabbi Mordechai. Thank you, all of you, for being here. It's really exciting for us to be able to talk to all of you about this. So I'm Sarah Eifler. I am the Director of Programming at Jewish Veg. And to give you a little more context on who we are a nonprofit organization. We are based in the US. We operate mainly in the US and Canada. And we do a variety of programming and events around sparking this conversation in the Jewish community about what it means to live and eat consciously and ethically in a Jewish way in today's world. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And of course, you just heard from Lisa, who's our amazing Director of Outreach and Engagement. You will be hearing later on from Dr. Richard Schwartz, scholar and author and President Emeritus of Jewish Veg, and the reason all of us are here. But I want to give you some grounding in the basic kind of walkthrough of why we talk about Jewish veganism as the Torah ideal. So I'm going to take us through that, and then we will hear from Dr. Schwartz, and then there will be time for question and answers at the end. So just a couple brief housekeeping things before I get on to a slideshow for you. If everyone could just keep yourself muted until we get to the question and answer period, just for the sake of time, because we have a lot of ground to cover. However, if you want to use the chat, please feel free. You can put questions and comments in there. Just know I'm not going to be able to see them while I'm sharing my screen. So they'll wait until the question and answer period, but we will get to them. And then, of course, if you need me to slow down, repeat anything, or if you have a clarifying question, at that point, you can unmute and ask me, and I will do as needed. And then if you could just repeat yourself. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Give me 1 second while I operate some tech. Oh, and if I could please get sharing permission from the host. Okay, and while we're
Mordechai, I don't know if I can do that.
Okay, if you could.
Sarah, you're now the co-host, so you should be able to share your screen.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, start this as a slideshow. Okay, so when we are talking about plant-based Judaism as the Torah ideal, I like to start at the beginning. And by the beginning, I mean the very beginning, and that is the story of creation. So of course we have Hashem separates the night and the day, separates the sea from the sky, creates all of the plants, creates the animals. And then Hashem says, let us create a human being, B'Tselem Elohim, in our image. And in doing so, they say this. And I did forget to mention that all of the translations are taken from Sepharia. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to jump around a little bit in English. So Hashem says, be fertile, increase, fill the earth, and rule all the living things. So I want to take a moment to just talk about this word rule. So you can see here the shorish of this word being resh dalet hey, which is a word that is connected to kingship. So rule in the sense of a sovereign, of a king. And we, in our modern world, the connotation of a king is a lot more negative than it was in the ancient Near East, and certainly at this time. When we think of kings, we tend to have this kind of European, like Louis XIV sense of what a king is as having absolute mastery and absolute control. But that's not what kingship means here. And that is not what kingship means when we think of Hashem and we think of our relationship with Hashem as Avinu Malkeinu, as our Father and King. That relationship that Hashem has with us, that relationship of care and compassion and responsibility, when we are created B'Tselem Elohim, that is the relationship that we are meant to then echo in our relationship with the animals that we are given this rulership over. And I'm just going to ask if everyone could please remember to stay muted. So there's no contradiction in this idea of rulership as we see it here, when the very next thing that Hashem says is, see, I give you every seed-bearing plant upon all the earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit, they shall be yours for food, right? In other words, look around, look at all of these plants, that's your food. There is no rabbi or scholar or sage who will argue about what this means. It is very, very clear and explicit. In the Garden of Eden, we are created vegan. And it's in the context of this sense of rulership and responsibility and being the representatives of Hashem that we are created in their image, that we have this relationship of care that we are meant to live out in all of the ways that we are on earth and explicitly in the food that we choose to eat. And I really want to emphasize this relationship because it's such a huge piece of what it means in Torah to have the sense of who we are and how we are in context of God's creation. So we have in Bereshit in 2:19, we have that God formed out of the earth all the wild beasts, all of the animals, brought them to the human to see what the human would call them, and what the human called each living creature, that would be their name. So this recognition and awareness of the personhood of the nefesh of each of the animals, that is represented in this moment of recognizing the human, recognizing who these creatures are, who these fellow creations of Hashem are, and understanding them and who they are and giving them that respect. So this concept, this relationship is what the vision is for Hashem in creating the world. When we're in the garden, this is what Hashem wants. This is what Hashem looks down and says, Tov Ma'od, very good. So what happens? Because we know that we do have permission to eat meat. We know that we are not told to be fully vegan by commandments at this point in time. We come to the time of Noach and the flood. And up until this point, we have remained, even after the expulsion from Egypt, we have remained at least vegetarian, if not vegan. And then we come to a time where, as Rav Kook puts it, we are at our lowest spiritual state. We're in this place of having decayed so far morally that Hashem has just gone to the very drastic measure of destroying the entire world, obviously with the exception of Noach and his family. So Noach and family emerge from the ark, and Hashem says this: the fear and the dread of you shall be upon all the beasts of the earth, all of the animals, they are given into your hand. And explicitly, every creature that lives shall be yours to eat. The first time that this permission is given to eat animals for food. Contrasting this passage with the previous passage of relationship and understanding and respect between human and non-human animal, and coming now to a place of fear and dread, we can see how drastic it has become, that Hashem has kind of moved from this place of not just wanting, but expecting that the human being will be able to live in this harmonious relationship, to now a place of, I have to recognize, Hashem, I have to recognize that you are not able to live up to that original ideal. Again, this is Rav Kook who speaks of this as this lowest spiritual state, and how the human being is now in a place of needing to prove and to elevate themselves and to grow into a place of coming back to that spiritual awareness. And Hashem gives us the tools to do that. With the permission to eat meat comes the very first restriction on what we can and cannot eat. You must not, however, eat flesh with its lifeblood in it. This is the precursor to the laws of kashrut. So we come from this place, this low spiritual place, and we elevate to a place where we get to all of these additional laws of kashrut, all of these understandings of what it is and what it means to eat in the Jewish context and in Jewish community. And we go from there and we have rabbinical laws that understand further what all of these laws mean. And so we are on this trajectory of growth. We are in a place of being able to be aware and conscious of the food choices that we're making in a way that is bringing us back to this original ideal state of living in harmony and peace with our fellow creatures. And in the meantime, we have not lost any sense of responsibility or care for non-human animals. I'm just going to highlight a few key places where this idea of needing to treat animals responsibly and with compassion shows up in Torah. Later in the Talmud named Sa'ar Ba'alei Chaim, preventing the suffering of animals. Of course, in Shemot, when you see the ass of your enemy lying under their burden and would refrain from raising them, you must nevertheless raise them with him. And I just want to quickly point out what the English translation does here, and using the word it's kind of adding this layer of remove, almost viewing the animal as object, which of course the Hebrew does not. In Devarim, you shall not plow with an ox and an ass together. Why? They're different sizes, they have different strengths and different speeds. So we have this understanding of our responsibility to care for the physical need of the non-human animal, but also the emotional need. You shall not muzzle an ox while they're threshing. Why? Because what the ox is threshing is their food. So it's like if we sent you to a Shabbat dinner and told you you had to keep your mouth closed the entire time. The level of frustration on the part of the non-human animal also matters. And that this idea, this concept of Sa'ar Ba'alei Chaim is a through line throughout all of Jewish sacred texts, that we must be conscious and aware and act in order to prevent the suffering of animals. We remain responsible as these original beings created B'Tselem Elohim, meant to rule in the sense of compassion and stewardship. And I want to jump out of Torah for a moment, just to kind of show that it doesn't end with Torah. It's throughout all of Jewish sacred text and tradition. And so going to Nevi'im, going to Isaiah, and of course, the beautiful vision that Isaiah has of the world as it could and will be. We have the wolf dwelling with the lamb, the leopard lying down with the kid, and of course, in the middle of this beautiful passage, we have explicit instruction on what we'll be eating. The lion, like the ox, shall eat straw. You can bet that if the carnivores are vegan, the humans are going to be. So we see over and over and over again throughout Torah, throughout Tanakh, and throughout all of Jewish text and tradition, we see how incredibly central the concept of food and food awareness and food choice is in all of our tradition. And as Rabbi Mordechai was saying, we have to be more aware now than ever, and we have the tools now more than ever to understand the impact of our food choices on ourselves, on each other, and on the world as a whole. And so in being aware of how the food choices we make and that our interactions with food are the primary way that we interact with all of Hashem's creation, that the choices we make around what we eat impact the environment, they impact our own health, they impact the health of our community. And Rabbi Mordechai spoke eloquently about COVID and where that comes from, as well as all the other zoonotic diseases. Avian flu is another huge one right now. And being aware of climate change and the environment through the food choices that we make, and knowing that we need to be having these conversations in Jewish community to understand what our text and tradition and what Hashem are guiding us towards. And that is the realization that we can make holy and sacred and important and real change in the world through the food choices that we make. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And I do see that someone's hand is raised, but I will ask, unless it is a clarifying question, if we can go now to hearing from Dr. Schwartz, because I want to make sure that as well as the Torah piece, you're also hearing about what our rabbinic authorities have to say. So Richard, if you wouldn't mind speaking now to what rabbinic authorities and texts and tradition have to say around Jewish veganism.
Okay, well, there are many rabbis today who are vegans, and bottom line is we're saying that there are six mandates that point to vegetarianism and even more veganism, the ideal diet, Jews, and really for everybody else today. And in the present world, by the way, Koha votes, Sarah, wonderful performance. I want to thank everybody for setting this up, such an important topic, and happy to get up at 2 a.m. here in Israel and to talk about it. So anyway, the important thing is 6 important mandates. These are to take care of our health, to treat animals with compassion, to protect the environment, to conserve natural resources, and help hungry people, and to seek and pursue peace. So I'm happy to talk about all of these just to give a little bit of idea. And Sarah spoke beautifully. Certainly compassion for animals is extremely important. The way that animals are treated today is very horrific, so far from what Jewish values, like she mentioned, Sabari Hayim, so far from Jewish values. And in addition, there's an important health issue that so many studies, peer-reviewed articles in respected science, medical journal point to vegetarian as ideal diet. And Rabbi Mordecai indicated about zoonotic diseases. Well, most of the evidence now is that this tragedy of the coronavirus very largely, definitely related to the mistreatment of animals. He said wet farms in China, so many others before, MERS and SARS, and bird flu. By the way, there was an article just a week or so ago indicating that the chicken coops in Israel, many health issues, many safety issues related to that. Okay, so again, we have these mandates, and happy to talk more about them. Wait for other questions from Sarah.
Well, so one of the things that that I brought up that I thought maybe you could speak a little bit more to was about Rav Kook and Rav Kook's interpretation of Noach and the flood. But I mean, Rav Kook wrote a whole book called A Vision of Vegetarianism and Peace. Can you speak a little about that?
Right. Well, actually, that was compiled by Rabbi David Cohen, father of Cohen. I'm trying to think of that. But anyway, that was his a vision of vegetarianism. He felt that actually in the Messianic period, people would be vegans at that time. And Sarah, as you mentioned, Isaiah chapter 11, verses 6 and 9, indicating that that would be in the ideal time to come, that there's a feeling, and also there's a midrash that people will be at a higher madrega in that Messianic period, and therefore there won't be a need for sacrifices, by the way. Well, they say that people high madrega, we won't need sacrifices for guilt offerings or for sin offerings, but that Thanksgiving offerings are always appropriate, and that, but those can be with grain. So we have that from Rav Kook, and many rabbis today also, again, moving toward vegan diet because of the health reasons and compassion for animals, And it's very, very important today. We want to just stress. And by the way, you mentioned again, we were created as vegans. That is consistent with what modern science is finding, that we are much closer to herbivorous animals. We don't have the claws of a carnivorous animal. We don't have the sharp, hard, dagger-like teeth of a carnivorous animal. Our intestinal system is 4 times stronger per unit height than that of a carnivorous animal. And in addition, our stomach acids are only about 1/20th as strong as that of a carnivorous animal. So again, consistent with Genesis Bereshit, as you pointed out, chapter 1, verse 29, we were created as vegans, and modern science is showing that that is the diet closest to what we should be. And one of the big problems, why there's really an epidemic of diseases in the world today, is that we, again, are created really as herbivorous, and most people have an omnivorous diets, and that's why there is an epidemic of diseases in the Jewish community and other communities.
Well, since you brought in modern times, I also wanted to ask you, you live in Israel, and we all know, I mean, Israel is the vegan capital of the world. So can you speak to why we're seeing such a huge like boom in Israel of veganism?
Yeah, but many people think veganism, Israel is the vegan capital of the world. Let's say the higher percent of vegans here than any other country, and especially Tel Aviv, especially many young people. And there's many, many vegan restaurants here. And it's one of the things that is really happening. Israel is on like a pioneer. We're called the startup nation. And there's many, many plant-based foods being developed. So this is another important thing, that it's much easier to be a vegan today, probably because of Israel again being a startup nation. There are so many plant-based substitutes for animal-based food, and they say some have the texture, taste, and appearance so close to the meat and other animal products that even long-time meat eaters can't tell the difference. So that makes it a lot easier for people to be vegans. And I'd like to believe that the important teachings that Sarah spoke about so eloquently, that is part of the reason. Also, you say, of course, that Jews, with the kosher laws, we're used to separating ourselves, keeping away certain foods, so perhaps that makes it easier. So there's definitely a higher amount, much easier here, abundance of fruits, vegetables, and can't say from personal experience, they say the meat quality here is not very good compared maybe to other countries.
Well, speaking of kashrut, and then after this we'll open for questions, but you mentioned that it's easier because Jews pay attention to kashrut, so we're kind of naturally paying more attention to what we eat, which is such an important thing because the laws of kashrut, kind of as I alluded to, are restrictions on eating animals and animal products. So can you speak a little bit about that and how kashrut kind of guides us towards this more vegan way of living?
Yeah, well, as I indicated, we're used to separating things. And by the way, some of you are probably very familiar with Rabbi Riskin, especially you probably know of him from Lincoln Square Synagogue and now Chief Rabbi of Efrat. One of the things he indicated in some of his articles, he said that the laws of kashrut are designed to teach us compassion and lead us gently to vegetarianism. So we have that, and again, technically something may be kosher. By the way, another very important factor is, unfortunately in Israel, especially, there's been many, many scandals in the kashrut industry. That reports on that. As a matter of fact, there's Rabbi Stav, who's head of a wonderful group called Zohar, and they give kosher certifications and all, who's indicated that everybody knows that kashrus in Israel is corrupt, and sort of negative things on that. So by far, far the easiest way to keep kosher, of course, is on a vegan diet. Certain things, we mentioned about bugs, you got to be careful about certain things, but on a vegan diet, no chance certainly to mix meat and milk and accidentally violate the laws of kashrut on that. Okay.
Thank you so much, Richard. So we want to open to questions, so we want to have plenty of time to be able to answer. And I know I saw a few hands, so I'm going to switch over to gallery view for a second. Morris, yes, I saw your hand. Do you want to ask the question? Oh, and if you could just unmute, because we can't hear you.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Schwartz, for making your book free online. That's very nice of you. And thank you, Sarah, for this opportunity. So quickly, I have a couple of questions. I'm a newbie to all this. Dr. Schwartz, we live in a cold country in Canada. How can we stay warm being a vegan?
Well, staying warm, first of all, if you're vegan, you're going to have a very warm heart. So that certainly helps. Well, from what I understand, they now have, in terms, we don't need fur coats, for example. They have so many synthetic things that can appear just like it, and just as warm and probably even warmer than that of fur coats and all. By the way, before I did get into all of these things, I mentioned the 6 mandates. Just want to point out the really most important reason, perhaps, for being a vegan today. The greatest threat to humanity is now climate change. And I want to just present this, and maybe feel free to challenge this, but the only possible way to avert a climate catastrophe is, and again, super, super difficult, but the reports are such. By the way, the UN Secretary General, because of the reports, more and more diet reports, and more examples. By the way, I understand now that in India and Pakistan, the temperatures are 115, 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Birds are falling out of the sky. Tremendous flooding. We know in the US and the West, tremendous droughts, wildfires. And by the way, every time there's like a wildfire, it makes it more likely that there's going to be future climate events. There's something what they call self-reinforcing positive feedback loops. And the climate experts think we may end up with an irreversible tipping point. So this is the greatest threat. I've been blessed. I've been in Israel 5.5 years, 4 grandchildren, getting married, 4 great-grandchildren, and wondering what kind of world I'm going to be leaving them. So the threats are super, super great. We're at 1.1 degrees Celsius above the temperature before at the beginning of the industrial age. They're projecting anything. It was just this week an article saying the temperatures in Israel projected to increase much faster. It could be as much as 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. You can imagine what we're seeing now with 1.1 degrees Celsius increase, about 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Anyway, here's the most important thing to avert a climate catastrophe, a society-wide shift toward vegan diets. And the reason I say this is 2 things. First of all, the cows give off methane, a very potent greenhouse gas, as much as 84 times as potent as carbon dioxide in heating up the environment. So if we have far less cows, that would end. And methane is only in the atmosphere like 10 to 20 years. Compared to carbon dioxide, it could be hundreds of years. So if there was a shift and we can get rid of that methane, it would be very, very important. But even more important, this is the critical thing. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was 285 parts per million. Climate experts think that 350 parts per million is like a threshold, just like we know with cholesterol. Above what the doctors say is 200 is dangerous. So 350, we're now at 420 parts per million and increasing. we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that's what they're aiming at, and zero emissions, very good, but not enough. But it turns out because of more and more animal agriculture, 25 billion farmed animals in the world at any one time, that vast amounts of the world's area, over a third, is used for grazing of animals and growing feed crops for animals. And if that could be reforested, we had tremendous amounts of forests. There used to be 6 trillion trees in the world. Now it's about half of that, about 3 trillion trees. And if that could be reforested, of course, that would sequester, absorb much of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, bring that down to a safer level, ideally below that 350. So that is, many reasons to be vegan, but that's the most important possibility.
Richard, I just want to jump in here as well and say to Morris that, these days people are so concerned about protein, and many omnivores are much too high in protein, and there's been no sign that vegans or people that don't eat animal-based protein are short or deficient in protein. And so I think there's no evidence that vegans are colder by any means. There's protein in things that we don't think of as having protein. People in their minds tie together, animal meat with protein, but there's protein in your avocado, and there's protein in your vegetables, there's protein in your beans. And so I don't think I've ever heard a connection about vegans being colder. I mean, I've definitely heard a connection about vegans being healthier and living longer and having less of those standard American or standard Canadian, I guess, diseases that, standard American diet diseases that we're so familiar with.
Right.
But what about the essential amino acids? I hear you can only get them in meat.
No, actually, not true at all. And again, the vegans have lived very healthily longer. There were some studies that show that vegans live 6 to 10 years longer. And Lisa makes a very good point. By the way, most of the early experiments on protein were done on rats. And it turns out that a human mother's milk is about only 6% of its calories in protein. Again,
Wow.
my granddaughter given me a great grandson, and he reinforced this, that a baby doubles his or her birth weight in about 6 months. And that's at a time when they're getting only 6% of calories from mother's milk and all. So anyway, a rat's mother's milk has about 47% of its calories in protein. The number one question I think that vegetarians and vegans get, how do you get enough protein? But the reality is that most people get far too much protein, especially from animal protein. And that is very negative for the kidneys. And it's also the number one reason for osteoporosis, because the human body can absorb carbohydrates and unfortunately unlimited amounts of fat, but it can't absorb more than a certain amount of protein. And if a person's getting more than enough of that from the animals, that's going to be excreted. But before that happens, the excess protein acidifies the blood, and Hashem has made it so that you need calcium to buffer or reduce the calcium, the excess acidity, so that a person can be taking in a lot of calcium from milk and oil. As a matter of fact, the countries that are drinking the most dairy products have the most osteoporosis. And when that excess protein is excreted, it also is taking some calcium out. So a person can have a negative calcium balance, even though they're drinking a lot of milk and getting a lot of...
Richard, I'm going to hop in too and just see if we can move to some of the other hands as well. And Yeah, I think that the idea that the essential amino acids could only come from animal protein is a like 30-year-old idea. We know that there's so many health things evolving, but vegans tend to be much healthier, and according to a lot of the more recent studies, and certainly don't have the high cholesterol, some of the cancer risks that are more prevalent. And so I would say the one supplement that most vegans take is vitamin B12, but no concern with protein and amino acids anymore. Eldon, I think your hand was up next.
Oh, thank you very much. So I had an interesting, so we know that Hashem, when he created the earth, he didn't create us to eat other living things. And when I and my wife decided to become vegetarians, more or less, that we did it more for number one, moral reasons and ethical reasons. We couldn't eat. We had 3 dogs, and we couldn't, we know their personalities and how loving they are, and how loving, if you've ever been on a farm or you ever milked a cow like I have, they feel the same way about their children, about their, babies as a dog, and they have love and emotions, etc. And Hashem didn't, in my opinion, didn't create us to eat these living things. And I've read your book, and I understand. And as we come closer to the period of Mashiach, right? I understand that our purpose, we will not eat meat again. But my point right now is, what about cultured meat? Now in Israel, Israel is always on the cutting edge of everything. I think 15% of the population is vegan, I think I read, which is more than anywhere, or something like that, more than anywhere in the world. You can comment on that, but meat grown from animal cell cultures. Now, a lot of people like meat. And I'm just wondering what all 3 of you think about. I know you probably wouldn't eat it, but it's less harmful on the environment. It's not really killing an animal. It's just, I don't know how they take the cell culture, they grow it, how they'll mass produce it. About what you think about people and how it relates to the Torah and the moral and ethical objectives of the Torah. And that's going to come in the next 3 or 4 years. It's just going to be too expensive to eat meat for many people. Probably McDonald's will be the first ones to offer, cell cultured hamburgers or whatever. So what do you guys think? And how does that fit in with the whole Torah, the Jewish veg ideal? And will you guys be eating these products in the 4 or 5 years when they become affordable?
Okay. Well, first of all, there's so many plant-based substitutes already. Again, as I said, with the texture, taste, and appearance so close to the meat product that vegans can't, and people who've been eating meat for years and years can't tell the difference. That's ideal. But if done, and by the way, I think that's the fastest growing part of the food industry. However, it's still many people they want that meat. So actually, I think it's not vegan, that process, but certainly, as you say, Eldon, and by the way, thanks so much for all you've done to setting this up. So it's certainly a tremendous step forward, as you say. It would reduce, first of all, one big issue I didn't mention, 70% of the grain produced in this country is fed to animals destined for slaughter, as 9 million or so people are dying of hunger every year, and over 10% of the world's people are chronically malnourished. So actually, it would save that, and it would certainly reduce the horrific mistreatment of animals that's occurring now, probably be better for health. Again, there's bird flu, there's a threat of salmonella that could be eliminated. So I think it's a great step forward. I think I and probably most vegans would not eat that, not necessary, because again, we have the plant-based substitute. And the ideal diet is really, as Sarah mentioned, a Gan Eden diet, fruits and vegetables, grains, legumes, and nuts and seeds.
Eldana, I'd love to answer that as well. I'm very interested in seeing how the kosher world thinks about this. I do see some positives related to it because initially you do need an animal and those animals are killed, unfortunately. But I think to keep it going, you don't. But there's a lot of practicality issues that make this still a really wasteful way of growing food, because these kinds of factories will use so much water and so much electricity that just growing healthy beans and grains from the ground that doesn't have all those issues. And in addition, I've read that the diseases that we're so worried about can still grow because these are still live animal cells. So it doesn't protect us from some of these disease outbreaks that we've had. And then of course, meat in itself is not considered a health food, you know, and red meat has been labeled a carcinogen by the World Health Organization. And so when you can get much healthier forms of protein based from plants, I just think that this doesn't solve a lot of the arguments, but I am interested to see where it goes. And I do know also that Israel is one of the food tech industry parts of the world that are leading efforts in growing this cell-based meat. Sarah, I don't know if you have a different answer from the other of us two.
I'm kind of, I also probably would not personally eat it. However, I mean, I am generally in favor of making any sort of transition or move towards more conscious and intentional eating in whatever form that takes. So I think all of us have our choices to make, and all of us have our personal decisions and thought processes to go through. And when we do that with consciousness and intention and awareness, that is when we come to being into this higher spiritual state. And I think that is possible to do with lab-grown meat as a replacement for animal-based meat, because you're taking a step and you're moving towards a kinder and less harmful way of living. And I absolutely believe in that. And at the same time, it's important to be aware of the things that Lisa's pointing out. But I do see that we have further questions, so I want to make sure that we get to those as well. So I guess Lisa, go ahead.
I think Rabbi Mordechai, your hand is up next.
Thank you. You know, I'm gonna let Shimona speak first. I'll go after.
Did you say me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, thank you. I just wanted to touch on the impact on the iron level of vegans and vegetarians, because a lot of them, or it seems that there's a high correlation between that and iron deficiency. And then of course, there's the question of the absorbability of the iron and the quality of the iron that you get from the dark green vegetables. And I know you can combine it with vitamin C to get a better absorbability, but seems to be problematic. So I just wanted to bring that up and see what your comments were on that.
I'd actually love to respond to that if I may, because I don't know if you can tell, but my family in general has issues with iron deficiency anemia, and none of the rest of them are vegan. I'm the only vegan. So living in the context of being something in my family where we're all extremely pale, and this has been kind of a health issue that we've experienced. Me as the vegan, I actually am perfectly great on my iron, and I get it checked regularly because we need to. And there have been times where I have been low on iron, and you know, there are supplements you mentioned, taking vitamin C along with some of those darker greens, but there's also iron in other produce as well. And overall, I actually, as a vegan, do better with iron than other members of my family who are meat eaters. So I absolutely hear you that it's important to pay attention to you know, where your nutrients are coming from and to know that you need them. Everyone, not just vegans, everyone should be taking B12 supplements, by the way. But also at the same time, some of the things that you'll hear, like the protein issue and like the iron thing that you kind of hear, oh, those are the vegan issues. If you look a little further, a lot of the time, those don't actually play out that way in reality. But there's this kind of preconceived idea of how much protein we need to be eating for one thing, or of how you know, there isn't enough iron in the vegetables and the plant-based foods that actually turn out to be almost the opposite in a lot of ways. And I want to let my colleagues answer as well.
Sarah and Shimona, I think we talked about this when we were planning this as well. What I think happens is, unfortunately, meat is so centered on the plate because of the commercials and because of the advertisements and because of the way in which our governments have invested in that being what needs to be on our plates. And so people just don't know how to eat well when they remove the meat. And so you do hear of people who feel weak or not as, or aren't getting the nutrients they need when they go plant-based. But I think it's just because they're not trained on how to substitute and how to make sure you're getting the right food in. I don't think it's because vegans in general are, anemic. It's just kind of a relearning process of what should be on your plate. And I would argue that even if you're not, mostly plant-based, that very little animal protein should be on your plate because it's so tied to all those other health issues that we know about.
Mhm. Okay, I just wanted to add that, as Sarah said, it's important to have tests perhaps every 6 months and be careful on that. And if need be, to have some supplementation. Sarah mentioned B12. Just want to point out the reason for that is that people used to get that from vegetables from the soil, but nowadays there's so many pesticides being used that's destroying maybe the bad bacteria, but also the good bacteria as well. So it's just this unnatural world with so many pesticides makes it necessary. But to have the B12, have those tests and all, but overall, that studies all over have shown much healthier conditions for vegans. By the way, one very important study, I don't know how many have heard about this, is called the so-called China-Cornell-Oxford study, or China study, for example, can only be done in China. When I speak in Israel, sometimes I ask people, how many of you were born here in Israel? And often that one hand goes up. And what that indicates is people from all over the world, makes it hard to do tests. But in China, people tend to stay in their village one generation to another, and diets from village to village are standard. And what this China study showed is that the fat content in the diet varied from 6% to 24%, much lower than in the States. But they found that even small amounts of animal products led to unhealthy results. So again, many studies. By the way, there's a study by Dean Ornish who showed that heart disease could actually be reversed on a vegan diet, with also people getting together, some exercise. So many studies and peer-reviewed articles in respected medical journals have shown the many health benefits of plant-based diets. Can prevent diseases, can reduce type 2 diabetes, heart disease, etc.
Can I talk, do you mind if I just interject my hands up? I just want to bring it back to Torah, right? We all know about the benefits of eating vegetables and fruit and all that. But the first, Dr. Schwartz, the first and second temple, the high priests, it was a lot of blood. There was a lot of blood going on. And we know, and in your book, you talk about it, that it was about the reasonings behind that. But I'm wondering, when the third temple comes about, what will we be doing? Will Hashem want us to sacrifice animals again? It seems to me that he wants us to go back to the period of the Garden of Eden, of Gan Eden, and not do that. I'm just wondering if you could talk about that and about the Torah aspect of that, if you don't mind, because I've always wondered. And I'm sure Rabbi Eli and you will get into a good discussion on that next week.
Right. Okay, well, I pointed out before, Rob Cook felt that in the ideal time to come, this ties in with Sarah's wonderful message where she talked about Isaiah chapter 11, verses 6 to 9, that in the ideal time, the wolf will dwell with the lamb, the lion will eat straw like the ox, as she pointed out. If lion, a carnivorous animal, eats straw like the ox, then people certainly should be vegetarian, vegan. Midrash indicates that people will be in a higher madrega, and we won't need sin offerings or guilt offerings. etc. So we should go wait and see what the prophet or Mashiach will say at that time, but hopefully that's ideal time to come. May it come soon. There will only be sacrifices with plants. And again, by the way, Rambam, Maimonides indicated the sacrifices were really a concession to the times. That was a common mode of worship in biblical times. And it was felt that if they didn't have sacrifices, which was just the only way that people knew about worshiping at that time, that Jews might have rejected that and maybe all of Judaism. So they did have sacrifices, but they were kept in one central location. And the idea was to wean people off of the pagan practices. Certainly human and child sacrifice were eliminated. And as you know, in the Nevi'im, the biblical prophets indicated that God's primary concern was more compassion and justice. And the Nevi'im even indicated that the sacrifices could be an abomination to God if not carried out in a society where justice and compassion were primary ideals and carried out.
I don't know, does Lisa or Sarah want to pipe in on that? That's kind of one that always troubled me.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. And I mean, Dr. Schwartz is the authority. And so I would honestly echo what he said. And I apologize, but I want to make sure Rabbi Mordechai has the chance to ask a question before we do need to come to an end.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask, you've raised a number of reasons why one should be vegan, ethical reasons, environmental reasons, health reasons, reasons of morality. I guess I could argue on some of them, but the nakud of my question is, ethically, if one's not eating or consuming animal products from an ethical angle, what is the vegan's philosophical approach or practical approach to using animal products in medical practices? Let's say using pig valves to replace human, cardiac valves. What about using animal products beyond medical purposes? If you could speak to some of those.
Okay. Well, actually, in terms of medical experiments, by the way, many of them have been very misleading because they say, something that's good for a dog may not be good for a cat. And animals are very different, of course, than humans. And artificially inducing disease to check out a drug or some kind of medicine often can be very misleading. So I think that there's tremendous advances now in using lab results and other things, and in terms of that. So anyway, again, only humans were created with Tselem Elohim, and to save a life, I guess it could be used if nothing else. But again, there's so many advances. The thing is, if people shifted to a vegan diet, there'd be far less need for all kinds of medical treatments and all. And to me, it's a shame that doctors primarily are not trained in prevention. And they know about using this pill, and if there's a negative effect, here's another pill on that. So bottom line, again, only humans created Tselem Elohim, and saving human lives is primary. But the best way to do that is shifting toward a plant-based diet and not depending on technology. But in the final analysis, human life is primary.
And I'll echo that too, Rabbi Mordechai. And I agree with everything that Richard said. And I've heard a lot of questions about the experimenting we do on rats, whether it's even applicable. But I will just say that most vegans, by the time you embrace a vegan diet, you're also starting to really think about like what your clothing contains and whether you're wearing leather, whether your couches are made of leather. And so I think that's like the next step on the vegan progress, to really be ethical and to use animals as little as possible and to not be contributing contributing to that at all. I did look up this number for another Canadian synagogue I went to, and I don't have it quickly in front of me, but I wanted to make it applicable to Canadians. But 10 billion land animals are killed for food in the United States. And that does not include the 47 billion aquatic animals that are killed for food. And that, nor does that include the animals that are eventually killed, or the male animals in the dairy and egg industry, because they're not food, they're just killed instantaneously. And so those numbers are very misleading. The Canadian numbers were a little bit lower, but why did I bring in the numbers? I think I just brought in the numbers to say that as we're thinking about the ethics of all of it, we're trying really hard to participate in none of it. But because of those massive amounts of numbers, it's sometimes very hard to get away, because I think animal products are so ubiquitous. They're used in tires for cars and stuff like that, because they just cannot possibly keep up with the amount of waste. But I know vegans really do try to be as animal, participating as little as possible in the use of animals for any of that kind of stuff.
So is that to say that a vegan would avoid having a pig's valve, let's say, replace a cardiac valve in their heart?
I think vegans would really, really struggle with that. I mean, it's tough because vegans do take medicine and do take vaccines, and at the beginning of the time that might have been tested on an animal or had an animal ingredient. But something so direct to, like, we're going to kill this animal to take their heart valve and put it in you, I mean, I as a vegan would not be comfortable with that.
And I'll actually come in from the other side and say, if it's to save a life, then that comes first. And as Dr. Schwartz said, pikuach nefesh, if I need that heart valve to live, then I as a vegan would absolutely accept that. But I think from the Jewish perspective, from the Torah lens, we're seeing how much waste there is in this system, and we're seeing the excessive and unbelievable cruelty in the system as it exists. And so when it's not necessary to sustain human life, then we have the choice.
And I think Richard brings up such a good point, where the reason why people are needing their hearts replaced is because they're eating too much pork or animal products. And so it's just like this issue keeps rolling around in a circle, where we know what the solution is. We know that people can be a lot healthier, that we can, not be killing as many animals, that we won't have some of the zoonotic illnesses we have, that we won't be having as many people be starving if we stop using animals. But since people don't want to do that, then they're pioneering new ways to give them a new heart. Eldon, were you going to close us up?
Oh yeah, I'm just typing away. I don't know if anyone have read the books by Dr. Michael Greger on how not to die.
Yeah.
I just bought the cookbook, and they're really good recipes, people. I mean, if you want to eat vegan, mostly vegan, vegetarian food, and really not notice any difference. I mean, this guy, you need to read his book. It'll answer all your health questions. It talks about the ethics and moral issues. It doesn't bring it into a Torah perspective, but he is Jewish, and he does talk about his mom. And he as every Jewish child, always goes back to their mom. He talks about his mom and how sick she was, and how she, started eating a vegetarian lifestyle. And really I can't remember what issue it was, but it cleared up in weeks or months. So really, we eat a standard American diet, which is called a SAD diet, which is really, really unhealthy. And my own personal perspective, it was immoral and ethical, but also health was this third reason why I started eating in this fashion. And I hope that you've all enjoyed this, that I purchased Dr. Schwartz's, even his first book on Judaism and vegetarianism, I think. It was written in the early 1980s. And I bought a hardcover, Dr. Schwartz, on Amazon, or maybe it was on Amazon, or one of the online. And that is my my go-to book. That is the most amazing book. If you can get an old copy of it. I don't think it's in print anymore, But I wanted to thank you three, and I really look forward to next week for another meal, but also for for Rabbi Carfunkel and Dr. Schwartz really getting into a good non-combative conversation. It should be interesting. Rabbi Carfunkel claimed he might be eating some Coney Island hot dogs during the whole process, but just to taunt you on, you know what the Carfunkels are like, right? Anyway, with that, thank you, everyone. And
I wanted to thank everyone for coming. This has been amazing. And again, Eldon, thank you for making this possible and for helping sponsor it. I just wanted to mention that I did recently actually see a Harvard study that was reported. It was a survey that indicated that 9 out of 10 cannibals say that in fact vegetarians taste better. So, you know, that's just kudos to you all. That's great. And we look forward to seeing you all next week, same time, same channel. And if you haven't registered for next week, if you'd like to sign up for the meal, please go online and you can register still for the meal. And if you don't want to register for the meal and you just want to come and join us, do that too. All right. Thank you all. Everyone should unmute themselves and we can all sign off.
Rabbi Bookbinder, can we get how do we get a link for the recording of this? Will you be sending it to, how will you make it available? Just wondering.
Yeah, so I did record this episode. I do have to edit out the beginning and the end a little bit. I have to make my jokes sound a little funnier. And then what I'll do is the link to the video will be available off the registration page. Okay. So that'll be good. And you'll be able to, I'll try to get some other jokes for next week also, so I'll have to do less editing. Okay. And there we go. All right, thank you all. Thank you all.
For having us.
Thank you
so much.
Dr. Schwartz, good morning to you and good night.
Yeah, good night, Dr. Schwartz. Thank you.
Good night.
So much for joining us.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you all. Paul, great questions.
Thank you for doing this. See you next week.
See you all next week.
And lots of challenging questions from Judaism as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Did you enjoy your meal? Did you enjoy your meal?
The meal was great.
I thought it was delicious.
My wife, I got to eat hers because she has an allergy to quinoa, and I couldn't remember I think it's probably what they spray on the stuff and not actually the quinoa, I think. So a few times she's eaten quinoa, right? I think she's gotten a little bit sick, so she asked me, she said, is there quinoa in the meal?
Yeah, there was definitely quinoa, yeah.
There was, huh? So
yeah, it was quinoa.
Yeah, so we're going to see how she ate about half of it. So hopefully her tummy won't hurt her tonight. Yeah, it doesn't bother me. It could be this. I think it's what they spray it with.
My son ate my meal, so I had to settle for something else.
Oh, it was delicious.
It was really good. I let Maddie know already. It was great.
Yeah, and so I have to order a third meal for next week.
He is a great caterer. He is amazing.
Okay, all. Thank you so much. Good night. Good night. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.